Good evening and welcome to KGNU's continued coverage of 2019 ballot issues and candidates facing Colorado voters this November. My name is Liz Lane and I'm pleased to be moderating tonight's discussion on Proposition CC, which would allow the state to retain excess tax revenue otherwise required to be refunded to taxpayers under the Taxpayer Bill of Rights or Tabor Amendment and spend it for education and transportation purposes. Here to debate the pros and cons of Proposition CC is first Colorado House Speaker Casey Becker, who represents Colorado's 13th District. Speaker Becker was a co-sponsor with fellow Colorado House member Jill McCluskey of House Bill 1257, which is the origin of Prop CC's place on this November's ballot. Speaking against the adoption of Proposition CC is Michael Fields. He's the executive director of Colorado Rising Action, which is working against Proposition CC. Michael was previously the senior director of Issue Education for Americans for Prosperity and the state director of Americans for Prosperity Colorado. Welcome to you both. It's nice to have you here. Before we begin, I just want to set up some basic housekeeping rules that KGNU likes to adhere to during these debates. Each of you will be able to give a 5-minute opening statement, and Casey is going to go first. Following that, Michael will speak, and after that, I will have a couple of questions for each of you to answer. We will give each of you an opportunity to follow up on comments that the others made, and then brief closing statements for each of you. Does that sound okay?
Sounds good.
Great. Well, let me begin by reading the actual text of Proposition CC, which the voters will face next month. It reads as follows, quote, "Without raising taxes and to better fund public schools, higher education, and roads, bridges, and transits within a balanced budget, may the state keep and spend all the revenue it annually collects after June 30th, 2019, but is not currently allowed to keep and spend under Colorado law with an annual audit to show how the retained revenues are spent." And we will now hear from the sponsor of House Bill 1257, House Speaker Casey Becker.
Well, thank you, Liz, for giving us a chance to talk about Prop CC. So the legislature referred Prop CC to the ballot because we believe the state's underfunding critical areas of state infrastructure. We have a booming population and a booming economy, and yet we're completely falling behind in investing in our education system, in K-12 and higher ed, and investing in roads, bridges, and transit. And this is really due to an outdated funding formula that folks put in the Constitution in 1992 that's really preventing us, when we have revenue coming in the form of income and sales taxes, to using that revenue to, in good times, invest in K-12, higher ed, and roads, bridges, and transit. So Prop CC will allow us, in years where the economy's booming, to keep the taxes we're already collecting. So this is not a tax increase. It just says the taxes you're already sending us, can we keep those and invest in roads and schools? So I think it's going to help fill potholes. I think it's going to help major highway projects, local road projects. It's going to allow teachers to spend money to attract and retain teachers, to invest in classrooms, do technology. And then really for higher ed, it will provide a lot of money in terms of scholarships so we can keep the tuition low. Right now, Colorado's 40th in the country for our investment in K-12. We're $2,500 below the national average. We're $4,500 per pupil below the national average in terms of higher ed funding. And we're one of the bottom 10 in the country in terms of per capita investment in our roads. So why, when we have the number one economy in the country, are we not making these investments? And it's because Colorado is not allowed, the state of Colorado is not allowed in when the economy is booming to actually keep and use the tax revenue folks are sending us. So we think that this is a simple, common sense proposal to make critical investments that we're not able to make today. No other state in the country does this. And, you know, that each each area, it's going to be divided a third higher ed, a third K-12, and a third roads, bridges, and transit. There's an annual audit, so you will know exactly how all the money is spent. And it still requires Colorado to have a balanced budget.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was Casey Becker. And now Michael Fields.
Thanks, Liz. I think the ballot language that you read was very important because it says that it's not raising taxes. It also talks about better funding roads and bridges. It sounds really good if you read it. I think the problem is it doesn't really explain what is going on here. And the fact that it is permanent is not in there. The fact that it has something to do with TABOR, Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, it's not in there. And the fact that it has to do about taking your refunds permanently is not in there. And so I think looking at the ballot language and looking at what it'll actually be are two different things. The biggest problems that I see with Prop CC is that there's really no guarantee on where the money's going to go. It says a third higher ed, a third K through 12, and a third transportation, but it's a statute. And as a statute, you can change that at any point. Future legislatures could go in and say, we're going to move this money around. And even Speaker Becker has said that you can't tie the hands of future legislatures. But I look at this as they're tying the future hands of taxpayers without that guarantee that it's going to go where it says it's going to go. I also have a problem with the fact that it's permanent. A lot of ballot issues that are successful, especially on the local level, are local, they're specific, and they're sunset. And that sunset thing is a big thing for Coloradans because they want to come back and look at whatever audit there is there and say, do we want to extend this longer? And you saw with Referendum C back in 2005, it was a 5-year plan, and then they had to come back, and now this is the first time they're coming back to ask for it. But doing it permanent and saying my kids won't have a vote on this in the future, and if there is a problem with the funding or the formula that we use, let's have a discussion about that. That doesn't mean that the government takes and keeps all of that money. If you look at polling across the state, the top two issues that people want fixed are our roads, and they want better teacher pay. And if you look at those two things in this bill, you cannot increase base teacher pay with this money. It is only for one-time money, so it cannot go to teacher pay. It also can't go to bonding long-term for roads. We don't like bonding. Nobody likes bonding. But a lot of these big projects like 2570, you have to make the long-term commitment with transportation dollars. We have made some increases in transportation dollars the last few years. We would like to see that permanent and come out somewhat of the general fund. You look at our state budget, I think the conversation we're having with people is our state budget is $32.5 billion, up from $19 billion just a decade ago. So we're growing at over $1 billion each and every year. Even the Denver Post, who's not a fan of TABOR, came out and said, we no longer believe that the general fund needs more revenue. What we need to do is prioritize, and I'm saying this now, that what we need to do is prioritize the money that we do have. You look at education spending. I'm a former teacher, and education spending is up 20% since 1990, adjusted for inflation. Teacher pay is down 20% during that same time. So more money is going into the system. It is not getting to teachers. And I think when you look at how much money goes to instruction, only 54% of the dollars we spend on education gets to instruction. In the states surrounding us, it's 64%, right? And if we did what they do, we'd have $800 million more to put in the classrooms, to put into for teachers. We have to have these fixes, and our funding formula for education needs to get changed too, because some districts get the short end of the stick when it comes to funding. And so having these discussions and saying, we want to make a better system before we put more money into it. And we're already growing. Only a third of the budget is under TABOR now. It used to be 2/3 of the budget. And so we're not talking about a lot of the state budget. They're going around it with enterprises and other things. But I think when you have that conversation about the fact that there isn't a guarantee, we've had this happen in the past where money has gone to other priorities. I just don't think that voters trust state government to follow through with what they say. And so I think these refunds that are projected to be $1.7 billion, according to the governor, over the next 3 years would be better spent in our pockets, going back to taxpayers. We have the number one economy in the country. We're spending a lot of money each and every year. And we do have some structural changes that need to happen. But I think Prop CC is not the answer, and definitely not this year.
Thanks to you both, Michael Fields and Speaker Casey Becker, for those opening statements. Setting aside for later the potential uses for these funds and the extent to which the state may or may not need them, I do want to help listeners understand the burning question about this, which is, because there are two different answers to this question: is Proposition CC in fact a tax hike, notwithstanding the prefatory language in the proposition? So I'm going to ask you, Speaker Becker, to address that first.
So Prop CC is not a tax increase. It does not create a new tax, and it doesn't increase any tax rate. In fact, we don't know from year to year if we're even going to collect any money from Prop CC, because what it does is say money that is over the state spending cap right now, and the Colorado economy is booming, so there is money over that arbitrary cap. We just want to be able to take that and use it. It's taxes you're already sending us. Can the state make those investments? So down the road, if there are Tabor refunds to be had, we're going to use those refunds for public investments, investing in our schools and investing in our transportation system. But we're not going to raise a tax. These are tax rates voters have already approved.
Michael.
I think it's clear that there's not a tax rate increase. I agree with that. The other side of it, though, is that if you keep and spend more money that would otherwise be refunded to taxpayers, the average person, if you just went out on the street and were like, look, you're not going to get your Tabor tax refund this year, do you think that's a tax increase? I think most people would say yes. And so while it doesn't increase rates, it does increase your tax liability. You owe more money and the state is going to keep that money. And again, they're not going to save it. They're going to spend that money. And so I think it's an easy discussion once you explain to somebody what is going on, that it's a tax increase regardless of the ballot language. I think the proponents constantly say it's not a tax increase. Look at the ballot language. Well, they made the ballot language. So I think that is a discussion that we have with voters, and it's a healthy one.
With respect to the tax rate, which in the state, I believe, is 4.32%.
4.63 for the state income tax, 2.9% for the state sales tax.
I guess I'll ask either of you to address that rate as compared to other states. We've heard now from both of you that Colorado's economy is booming and that by some measurements, it's the number one economy in the country. We have a 4 plus, a little bit more than 4.5% flat state tax. I understand that only about another 9 states have a flat tax. And just taking a brief look at it, it looks like California is up to 13%, Hawaii is 11%, and the number 10 in the top 10 is the District of Columbia at 8.9%. So arguably, Colorado's income tax rate is half what the 10th in the top 10 list is. And I'm wondering if that rate has stayed flat over some number of years, even as the state has had such an influx of population, so much growth, so much expansion. Is there an argument that a tax rate might have been something that would have helped the state take advantage of the interest here, take advantage of the economic investment here, take advantage of the economic development, but that hasn't happened? So I just want to address it from that perspective, that Coloradans are paying a relatively low rate of tax already, and perhaps arguably there isn't sufficient additional investment going into the state at this time of opportunity.
So I agree that Colorado is a generally low tax state. Our income tax is flat, which I don't think is the right way to be taxing in a state. And our sales tax is low. Different states rely on different sources of income. Those states that have lower general tax liability than us on a per capita basis, lower than Colorado, are states that have that tax their natural resource extraction much higher than us. North Dakota, Alaska, Wyoming, Texas, they get a lot of their revenue from actually taxing coal, oil, and gas, and things like that. We don't do that here in Colorado. So the states that are lower than us are making up the difference by taxing natural resources. I think that Colorado is having a booming economy, and because of that, we should be able to use that to our advantage to catch up on our roads. Colorado also has a gas tax that has not increased in 27 years. In 1992, it was 22 cents. It's 2019, and it's still 22 cents. And we've lost I think 50% of the buying power in that. That 22 cents from 1992 is only worth about 10 cents, 11 cents today. So we have to make up the difference. And in the meantime, what we've seen happen in Colorado is, for a variety of reasons, local government isn't paying in as much to fund schools. So that burden has shifted to the state. We now have to, we don't have enough in transportation dollars, and we are just cutting into higher ed spending, cutting into K-12 spending, because we aren't increasing taxes. The legislature can't do that. Folks are supporting local taxes, but at the state level, we've only passed a cigarette tax and a marijuana tax. So we are missing opportunities of having we could take advantage of really good times right now and use that to our advantage, to invest in roads, to invest in schools, to invest in higher ed, to help keep tuition at CU, for instance, lower. But we're not doing it. I think it's a missed opportunity. And all we're going to do is end up in a recession, have not made these investments, and only make our state worse off because of it.
So tax policy is very complex. You have income tax is one thing. You also have, as we've mentioned, severance tax, gas tax, you have sales tax, you have property tax. And so when you're comparing states, you normally do the whole tax burden and what that might look like, because some states don't have an income tax and they have a heavier severance tax or whatever. But I think when you look at it, I think that tax policy does matter, and it's one of the agreements that I have with Governor Polis, who wants to cut taxes 3 to 5% and close some loopholes on taxes in order to help pay for some of that. But I think, I'm somebody who believes that if you can keep your income tax at a predictable level, then you can have businesses move here, and you have an influx of people like we're seeing right now. I grew up in Illinois, and in Illinois, there's 100,000 net people leaving that state every year. Connecticut has a very similar response because they raise taxes whenever they want to spend on something else or don't have enough money, and they're not prioritizing their budget right. And so what you see is real impacts of raising taxes because people can go somewhere else. Over there, you can go to Indiana or Wisconsin. Here, you could go to Utah. I don't want to turn into that kind of state. And so I think this is a very healthy discussion to have. And I like that the people in our state have the vote to say, you know what, if you're going to raise our rates, Tabor says that you got to come and ask them. And so, I hope that Governor Polis is able to pass that and lower rates a little bit further.
I think that we are light years different than Illinois in 1,000 different ways. This measure doesn't amend Tabor. Tabor says, look, we are going to require that any tax increases go to voters. We're also going to say that the state cannot, and any local government cannot keep revenue above a certain limit. And if you want to change that, you go to voters. We are going to voters. So we are doing what Tabor asked, and we are nowhere in 1,000 ways like Illinois. We are not at risk of becoming a heavily burdened tax state, because voters aren't going to approve the tax increases at the state level. They're not often asked, but when they are, they typically don't pass. And what happens is we are only disadvantaging our own state. You cannot have a successful economy, you cannot have a successful state if you're not making important investments in public infrastructure. This is investing in our students, in our kids, in our universities, and in our roads. We should be doing this.
Michael, I want to ask you about the tax refund angle of this, because if Prop CC passes, then the state will be allowed to retain any excess revenue over the revenue caps, and taxpayers will not be eligible to receive a refund, as Tabor sets forth. Looking at this, and you can challenge the numbers happily, but single filers that earn between $39,900 and $85,300, so solid middle class earning there, they would miss out on between $35 and $40 a year, and a joint filer within that same range of income would be missing out on between $70 and $80 a year receiving that. Obviously, that's a night out or a utility bill maybe for a month. But when you understand that it's really just under $100 that individuals may be getting back, and at the same time, we are aware of just last year the hours that Coloradan commuters spend in cars. I mean, it stretches out to weeks a year. The $1 billion in that range of lost productivity that our transportation situation, our road situation provides people. The recent reports on diminishing air quality here on the Front Range, I'm sure you agree that these are issues that need to be addressed. I'm just wondering, if we don't pass Prop CC, where might these funds come from?
Sure. I think it's a good question in that the fact that, how much is the refund? I think we can look at the numbers and there's different projections, and we don't know year to year what that might look like, right? It could be a lot more. It could be nothing. It's been nothing a lot of years. But yeah, it could be a couple $100 over the next 3 years for a family. I think the point is that this is permanent, right? That we don't know. It could be hundreds of dollars in the future. It might not. But I think the larger discussion is, what are they doing with the $32.5 billion that they already have, right? This is another 100 or 200 million, or, could be 300 or 400. But looking at it and saying, look, if you can't fix our roads with $32.5 billion, why are we going to trust sending even more money to you? But I think the larger argument on the refund side is that the formula that we're talking about, population plus inflation, makes it so that we are managing our growth, right? We are making sure that when there's a recession, we're not cutting even more spending and falling further into a hole. Because that's what a lot of other states did. They spend every cent they have, they put it into certain programs, and then when it dips, they aren't able to recover as fast. I think the fact that I think there would be a lot better case if they said, we're going to take your refund money and put it in a savings account. So when the recession happens, that's what we'll have money to spend on to make sure we don't have to dip in terms of, our services. But I think, looking at it, what are we doing with the current budget? In terms of the prioritization side, they just got, as I mentioned, $1.35 billion on average every year, new money. They just passed hospital provider fee a couple of years ago, which was $600 million new dollars every year that came in. They did put some towards education and some toward transportation. What they're not doing is fixing that in the budget for the long term. And that's what I would like to see, is you don't need to cut anything. You need to spend the money that we're spending on roads right now, bond that, and fix that in for a long period. So I think the lack of commitment to putting it towards education and transportation over the long haul is the problem. We don't need to make cuts when we're getting more and more revenue in each year.
Before I give Casey a chance to respond, I just want to ask you about bonding for road infrastructure, transportation improvements. Doesn't that incur an interest charge that the state has to pay?
Sure.
That's money that's coming out of the state.
Absolutely. I think if we could find a way to fix $9 billion of problems within, by spending a couple, $10 million here and there, that would be great. The problem is we've had a model that shows if we're going to make a T-Rex type fix to 25, we have to do a big investment and we have to bond. And that's a common thing to do. I would rather us not, but it's just not possible to fix the amount of transportation infrastructure we have. And I think both sides have agreed on that. Now, the disagreement is the revenue side, right? Because last year they put transportation stuff on the ballot. One was bond without new revenue. The other one was bond with, and they both failed. But looking at it and saying, I think both sides have acknowledged to do big projects, you need to bond.
Casey.
So, Liz, I think you make a great point. Right now, people are spending more on car repairs than they would ever spend in a given year on Prop CC. And you're spending a lot of money on car repairs because our roads are in disrepair. To the point that Michael made about this being permanent, anytime voters want to go back and say, we don't want you to have this money, they are welcome to. At any point, it doesn't take away anyone's right to vote on this or change reverse course.
Or future legislatures passing this out as another proposition in the future.
Absolutely. That's 100% right. I think the key thing is we are not managing growth right now in this state. We are growing, but not giving ourselves the tools to deal with it. So, Colorado's now able to collect internet sales tax. Great, except we're over the taper cap. We can't even keep the money. Wouldn't it be better if we could invest it? And, one thing that Michael said as well, I think it would be better if we put in a savings account. Well, if we just put in a savings account, you're going to say, well, it's not specific how it's being spent. They could spend it in any way. We know the areas that we're not investing well in: higher ed, K-12, and transportation. That's exactly how this money is going to be spent. So, I think that in the end, this could end up being a cost savings. It's going to help students in higher ed. It's going to help teachers in classroom. It's going to help people who have to make car repairs every day. So these are just good investments.
I want to ask you a question, Casey, and it is related to future legislatures and the extent to which a Prop CC that the funds might be spent in different ways. Since it is a statute, as Michael correctly pointed out, what are the limits, if any, or what would be the procedures, if any, that a future legislature would have to go through to, again, assuming that Prop CC passes and that these excess revenues do not have to be returned to taxpayers? To what extent might a future legislature be able to use these funds for something other than K-12, higher ed, or transportation, because maybe those areas have been addressed?
So, Liz, we very specifically say in the bill where the money has to go. A third higher ed, a third K-12, a third roads, bridges, and transit. The bill requires that there be an annual audit, and I have no doubt that Michael, that you as a journalist, that any reporter down at the Capitol is going to cover that very well. If there was even, for some reason, the legislature didn't spend it in the right way. There's no precedent of the legislature coming in after a ballot measure and undoing what voters did. And this ballot measure isn't any different than any other ballot measure. So I just think it's disingenuous to say you've got to go to the ballot, but going to the ballot isn't good enough. So if you're going to send folks to the ballot on this, you have to be okay with what we're sending to the ballot. If whether it's referred by the legislature or citizens put something on the ballot, it's just disingenuous to say you have to go to the ballot, but you can't trust what happens at the ballot. We were very specific. We put in very strict accountability. And I think future legislatures will hold to that. And if we don't, I won't be there, but folks are going to hold them accountable. I think that's called democracy, right? This is how democracy works. Things can change, but it's in the ballot language. That's what voters are going to prove, and it's not any different than any other ballot measure.
Who's going to conduct the audit? I'm just curious. Is that set forth in the statute or the proposed statute?
It says it has to be an independent audit, so a third party will be hired to do an annual audit. I don't know who that third party is going to be.
Michael?
I just wanted to comment that there is precedent for promises being made and then not follow through afterwards. And I think Ref C was a great example of it. You can look at a chart, and I know the proponents of CC have a chart that shows Ref C money went exactly where we said. Well, money's fungible, and higher ed is a great example. And we're sitting here in Boulder right now where CU is, and Hank Brown was a big supporter of Ref C, former senator, former president of CU, and he's on our side against this time because he said, look, I looked at the numbers, and I looked at them too, and the Ref C years were lower money went to higher education during those years than the years before that. They said this money is going to go here, and they cut the rest of the budget for higher ed, and we've seen higher ed continue to go down each time. And so I think there's a trust issue, and even 2 years after Ref C passed, the Metro Chamber downtown who supported Ref C did a poll, and only 17% of the people in Colorado felt that the money went to what they said it would go to. There is a trust problem, and it was clear on why that was the case. And so I think when you look at it overall, I don't trust future legislatures. I don't know who they are. I don't believe that they're necessarily going to spend it the way that they are saying that they are right now. And I think it's clear if it's something as a statute and not an amendment, it is a legitimate thing to talk about, is that money going to go where it said? And one more point, hospital provider fee a couple of years ago that we mentioned earlier, they said this is a one-time fix, right? We're going to do this process. It's a one-time thing. And now this year, a couple of years later, they look at it and say, you know what, we're going to do a fee for family leave or something else. They're already breaking those promises from 2 years ago that they would not use that process to go around Tabor and go around the general fund.
So Michael referred to Ref C. That's something that passed in 2005. That was a Tabor timeout. The reason there was less money in higher ed after that is because we had the biggest recession that the country's ever faced. So Ref C passed November 2005. 2006 was the next year, the first budget year that happened after that passed. And then we had a major recession starting in 2007. Ref C money went exactly where it was supposed to, but it didn't specify percentages. And it listed everything under the general fund and said it can go to any of these areas. So we are giving specifics about where the money has to go. We are giving percentages about where it has to go. We are limiting where it can go.
With respect to these three pies, roads, bridges, and transit would be a third. K-12 public schools, higher ed, and for each in fiscal year 2020, it's about $100 million for each of those three categories. Some of that transportation money is going to be going to is directed and must go to counties and cities. So I'd like you to address that specifically, Casey, as part of the overall bill that you passed. Why that was important? I know that was part of either 108 or 109. I can't remember. But why is that important? And Michael, if you have any particular objections to that angle of it. So Casey.
So for the portion of transportation funding of REFC passes, the portion that goes to transportation is 18% for cities, 22% for counties, 15% transit, 45% to CDOT for major projects. There are needs all over the state in terms of transportation, and you can fix a highway, but if you just get onto local roads and they're a mess, you're still going to be sitting in traffic. I don't think that this is enough money to fix all of our transportation needs, but I think it's a good start. So we want to make sure that there's local decision making and that we're addressing the needs, from north, south, east, and west.
I think in terms of transportation, we talked about audits a little bit earlier. CDOT just had an audit that came out, and basically it said that they spent 37% more than their budget. There's a lot of not reporting things the right way. I think the legislature needs to do a good job of getting under control how we are spending money currently. Obviously, local issue, there's local issues and transportation needs on the local level too, but CDOT is a big piece of that. And then rural roads. In rural Colorado, our roads are ranked second to last in the nation. Right. And a couple of years ago, when hospital provider fee passed, the rural sustainability of rural Colorado, we want to see more money going towards rural roads, too, in order to make the improvements that need to happen. And I think until the legislature shows that they're going to put this money where they said that they're going to do it and continue to do that, I think we're going to have a problem. When CDOT's buying, a new headquarters that are $150 million and money that could go to roads, I think there's a trust issue with how road money is being spent right now.
If voters agree, if a voter or a group of voters would agree that, yes, the roads are terrible, I'm spending far more time now in traffic than I did 5 years ago, but the objection is that it's cars and roads and that all this money is going to sort of prop up and improve a way of getting ourselves from A to B that over time perhaps is not sustainable, either from an environmental perspective or from just a volume perspective. Why is there any, I guess cities and counties can spend some of their money on alternatives? Is that the thinking? So
cities and counties will decide for themselves how they're going to spend it. I think Boulder is going to spend it differently than Lamar. And that's the Colorado way, is to have really a lot of local decision making. So that's another advantage of this measure, is it provides for a lot of local decision making.
Michael?
I think local decision making is a good thing. I don't think we disagree on that. I think obviously RTD falls outside of what we're talking about with the state budget here. But I think there is still a problem with people wanting other modes of transportation besides roads. Roads are heavily used. People like using them in Colorado. And RTD came out and it said this last year they had $777 million in operating costs and only $143 million in revenue. I mean, this isn't even close to the numbers that you would want to see in terms of people using it. And so I think we need to be smart about fixing and the things that need to be fixed. And I think the majority of people would say that's roads right now.
I think you and I agree that we're not fans of RTD.
So, Michael, let me ask you again, back to this idea of investment. You noted that Colorado's rural roads are, second to the bottom. Our investment per pupil in students is in the lower quartile, if not lower in the country. Our air quality. I mean, where, as wonderful a place as it is to live here, and if all of these things got done and corrected, it would almost be an embarrassment of riches to, have such a thriving, wonderful state with so many natural resources, and as well as access to all sorts of cultural things and educational opportunities, labs, etc. But what about this just idea of investment, of taking public money and making our communities better at every level? We haven't even, there's so many other areas where Colorado is in need, in housing, in healthcare, and so many other things. This this proposition is just tackling part of that. But I am interested in your concept of investment and where those funds would come from, if not something like this.
Sure. I think I think Colorado is a great state for all the reasons you just said. I have 3 little kids, 6, 3, and 15 months right now, and I want the best Colorado that they could possibly have. I want a good education system. I want good roads. I want a good, air quality, everything that you said there. I think when you look at it, I just would argue that we are investing a lot of money. For example, since the recession,
our status is low.
Well,
measurable status in these
I think
areas
a lot of I think a lot of times you can look at the numbers based on different states, like education. You have New York spending $23,000, right? And then next door you have Utah spending a little over $7,000. I think a lot of it has to do with how we spend it too and where that money is going. But I would also say, you're looking at all these things and saying we are spending a lot. Since the recession happened in 2008, our general fund, the percentage growth in our general fund is second in the country. Right. So a lot of these states have had a hard time following back from the recession, but we've bounced back pretty quickly. And part of that is our energy development in the state. Part of it, I think, is Tabor keeping things under control in terms of spending. But we are still spending more. We are still being successful. And as we are successful in personal income growth, we're number 4 since the recession. As businesses, as individuals do better in this state, government does better too. They do get more money, and that has been happening. I think, if you want to make investments, and I think a lot of localities do this a lot, they raise taxes for different stuff, and that's a healthy discussion to have because they trust their county officials, they trust their city council. I think we have a trust problem with state government in this state. And I mean, one thing, the story came out last week that said that the legislature has overspent by $100 million for next year already. Right. So now they're looking for money to fill that void. I think we just need more responsibility, more trust in state government before asking for that more money. And we're investing a ton.
First of all, I think the distrust really lies with the federal government right now. I think there's a lot of strong distrust of the feds. Right now we have a system where you have and have not counties. In Boulder County, we can pass local mill levies to invest more in our schools. But I represent 4 other counties, and they can't pass those local mill levies because they have to go to voters. And even if they do pass them, there's not the tax base there. And that's not the type of community I want. I don't think that's just and fair. I don't think your zip code should determine the type of education that you have access to. So we have got to help level the playing field. We've got to help kids as much in the rural states as in, Boulder or Cherry Creek schools. And this is going to help that.
I agree that we shouldn't have and have-nots, that our education funding formula has a problem. And I was talking to somebody from Sterling today, and they said, look, our schools aren't getting the resources that we need. And it's somebody who's against Prop CC. But he said, look, we're just putting more money into the same system. What we need to do is restructure the system so that there aren't these districts that are getting subsidized by the state when they could do that at the local level. Everybody across the state says we need to change the funding formula. That has not happened because it is going to be tied to a tax increase. If they fix the funding formula first, then people might invest more into it. But until that happens, why would you keep putting money into the same system that is unfair to certain districts?
So it's time now for the closing remark. I want to thank you both very much for all of this great detail on this important proposition that voters will be considering. And I know you'll be talking about it for about another month. So thanks so much for spending the time here at KGNU. And I think, Michael, you will go first with your closing statement, and then Casey, and then we'll say goodnight.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me on. It's always great being here with the speaker, too. I think this is an important issue, what we're talking about, how much investment, how much, the government should be keeping, how much, what would taxpayers do with this money is all a very healthy discussion to have. And I hope that this discussion about how we fund things, what we prioritize, remains an issue whether this wins or loses. I think when it comes to Prop CC, I think people need to know what this is really about. And it's about taking your Tabor tax refunds forever. You might not get that out of the ballot language, but if you read up on it and you educate yourself about what this really means, it is taking away those Tabor tax refunds forever. And there's no guarantee on where that money is going to end up. It's going to, it says in the ballot language, it's going to start with education and transportation. And future legislatures could always change that, and the money is fungible. And so you never know where this money is going to go. I think we have a growing state budget, and we need to prioritize roads. We need to prioritize teacher pay. We need to have discussions with districts about making sure that money's getting into the classroom. But I think we live in a great state, and I'm glad that we're able to have these types of discussions, and Tabor allows us to do that because we get to vote on these things. And I think that's very important. If this is the first step to trying to repeal Tabor, we're going to continue to fight against that, which we think that it is. But I think the current formula that we have set for the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights is benefiting our state. We have the number one economy in the country. When Tabor passed in 1992, they said there would be chaos, that we'd be closed for business, that the Pope wouldn't be safe. The Pope made it. He lived 12 more years. But I think, looking at people and holding state government accountable is an important thing. And so I trust that voters will make the right decision and vote no on Prop CC.
Prop CC simply allows us in good financial times to invest in the needs that we have in the state that will help millions of Coloradans. We are not repealing Tabor. We are just asking voters, can we keep and invest the money you're already sending us in taxes? It won't yield new money to the state in times of recession. So it's not going to be a hit to your pocketbook, at the worst times. It only happens when we're in good financial times. Voters can always go back to the ballot and change it. And in the meantime, we're going to help schools. We're going to help with scholarships. We're going to help with roads. We're going to help with deferred maintenance at higher ed institutions. These are all things that we should be doing when times are good. That's just what you would do in your personal life. It's what we should be doing at a state, because to not do it is just irresponsible.
That was House Speaker Casey Becker speaking in favor of Proposition CC. We've also been pleased to have with us Michael Fields. He's the Executive Director of Colorado Rising Action, previously the State Director of Americans for Prosperity. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.